Welcome to the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers. There are no traffic jams along the extra mile when you're studying for your bar exam. And now your hosts, Jackson Mummy and Megan Saya from Celebration Bar Review.
Welcome to this week's episode of our podcast. Megan and June are taking some well-deserved time off now that the February 2022 bar exams are over. They'll be back in a couple of weeks to rejoin me. We'll talk about everything that happened in February, try to recap the exams around the country for you and keep you up to date and start to aim at the July 2022 bar exams. This week, we thought we'd do something a little bit different with the podcast. I had the opportunity recently to do an interview with someone whose work I really admire in the area of productivity and intentional study and focus. It's a writer and author from the UK. Her name is Mich Bondesio, and she is a remarkable human being. She's the founder of something called Growth Sessions, and she's the host of a podcast called Creating Cadence. I love that word cadence, and she and I talk a lot about what cadence means when you're studying and thinking. She publishes a newsletter in the UK and around the world called Cadence, Life and Work in Motion. She's also authoring a book on that topic, and she is a writer, a coach, and a consultant with a focus on what she calls intentional productivity, which I thought was really amazing. Mich and I talk about mind mapping, we talk about using index cards, we talk about atomic habits and taking small steps and putting balance back into your life. It was a great conversation. Loved talking with her, and she is just filled with a great perspective on how one studies and keeps their life in balance while they're doing these big high-stake things like taking a bar exam. So we had a great conversation, and I wanted to share that with you this week. We're going to link to Mich's work so that you can check it out for yourself. I highly encourage you to do that and to subscribe to her podcast and check out her newsletter, and certainly to follow her teaching when it comes to these, what she calls paper-based productivity tricks and rules, because I think they work really well. All right, I don't want to waste another moment. Let's go ahead and jump into the conversation that Mich and I had as we talked about this thing called cadence. We're here today with Mich Bondesio. Mich, it's so great to meet you and to be able to have this time with you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Jackson.
Yeah, and you can tell folks that she doesn't live in Orlando, Florida. So we're very excited. You're in the UK, and you and I connected through a shared love of something called the Thinker's Journal, right?
That's right, the Thinker's.
Yeah, it's a very exciting project that takes digital and written forms of communication and manages to archive them and to think about what we're doing and actually put that all together. And you had written some articles for those folks that just jumped out at me because they used a word that I had never thought of in intentional study and work, and that word was cadence. Can you explain what you mean by cadence?
Yes, of course. So the idea of cadence actually came out of my own experience with burnout and recovering from burnout. I worked for 20 years in communications and project management across a host of digital and creative industries. And those are high pressure environments generally. But I reached a point in my life where I was experiencing extreme stress on both the home and the work front for a long time. And as a result, I experienced a really epic bout of burnout, which meant that I actually was unable to work for more than a year. And as part of my recovery process, I started looking at ways to work in a better way and live in a better way. And I realized that I needed to balance things better. But I also realized that term work-life balance is actually really unhelpful because it's actually a static concept. So I don't know about what your listeners and viewers might think when they hear the word balance, but for me, it's about level, keeping things level. So I think about scales and I think about maybe a seesaw in the playground. And what happens in those situations is that if they're unbalanced, it implies to our brain that we're winning at one thing and we're losing at something else, and that we have to try and keep things like this all the time. But the reality is that in our lives, there's always things demanding our attention. Sometimes one thing will be doing that more than another. And so it's really hard to keep that kind of static balance in play all the time. We need to be able to move in all facets of our life because our life is always moving around us, even when one thing is demanding more than the rest. So I settled on this idea of creating work-life cadence and looking at ways that I could do that in my life and in my work. And I created a framework and went back to working in communications once I was recovered and had my energy and stamina back. But I was doing all this research and discovering that there were loads of people experiencing burnout. There were loads of people who weren't working in healthy ways. They also didn't necessarily know how to manage their stress well. And so I started sharing this concept and teaching this concept and running workshops and offering talks and doing online courses on it. And the focus around Cadence is really about building strong foundations. It's about these small steps that we do regularly, repeatedly, building these practices and these habits that help us to create momentum and continue moving. And they're all about practices and skills that we add to our toolkit that help to support our body and our mind. So it's all about managing your stress, building resilience, being more mindful about how you're living and working.
Yeah, I love this idea of balance, because when someone is studying for a high stakes exam like the bar exam, there is a tendency to say, I'm having a crisis, and my crisis now dominates everything around me. It impacts my family relationships, my work relationships. It makes me eat less healthy. It makes me stop working out. It causes me to lose sleep. And all of this is in the name of somehow I'm going to get better at my studying, but it never works that way, does it?
It never does. You're quite right. Unfortunately, all of these important foundational practices that you referred to, like sleep and nutrition and movement, meditation and building strong mindsets approaches, they're the things that fall to the bottom of the list when we think there are other things that are more important. But actually, they should be at the top of the list because they are the foundational things that will support us in everything else that we're doing in our life and our work.
And so to get at this idea of foundation, how do you help your students begin to assemble some kind of work-life balance so that they don't experience this burnout that you had and that so many people get?
So the first point is to understand where you're at. We have to work from a baseline before we can make any change. So it's really about awareness. What am I doing that's supporting me, and what am I doing that is not? How do I respond in certain situations? How do I deal with stress? And then from there, it's about making really small incremental changes and building on daily practices, building daily practices all the time. And I've heard in some of your podcast episodes where you focus on the process instead of the outcome. This is exactly the same. It's about honing the process. It's about developing mastery, mastering the skills around learning and around being well, because well-being sits at the core of all of it.
Yeah, sometimes I find people in the midst of this burnout say, I don't have time to master any of those things, right? You deal with somebody that's just, they're in that moment of chaos. I think of them as the white rabbit moment. They are just so wrapped up that they can't see their way out of it.
There are certain exercises that I do with my students. Very often, a lot of what's keeping us busy and occupied are unhelpful things, like using our phone, for example. It's very distracting. And we find ourselves procrastinating. We find ourselves avoiding things. All of these avoidance behaviors are because they're a response to stress, really. So it's about identifying what are we doing when we're feeling stressed, and it's about finding ways to alter what we're doing. So you have to replace the behavior. You can't just remove it because you'll find something else that's negative to replace it. So you have to find positive things to do.
Yeah, I love listening to your podcasts, and you have probably some of the best podcast titles I've ever seen. But one of your podcasts is called Fractured Focus. And that's really what this is about, right? I'm going in so many different directions that I can't really get my focus in any one place.
That's absolutely true. Our attention is constantly being threatened by everything that's around us. We have a deluge of content coming at us in a variety of different ways every day. And some of it is intentional. Some of it we're not even aware that it's appearing in front of us. It's the advertising, it's the social media, it's all the newsletters, all the emails, all people wanting every moment of our time. And it's learning about how we can create some space so that we can think, and some space to breathe.
When you started to dig out of your own burnout and started thinking about this, how hard was it for you to start to create that intentional space?
At the time, I wasn't thinking about whether it was hard or easy, but for me, I would find there were some days where I felt like I was failing at even starting my day. Other than getting dressed and getting started, I didn't feel like I was achieving very much. So I started saying to myself, tomorrow's another day. I'm going to start again and see if I can do better tomorrow. And that's where this idea of building the practice started. It's okay, I've done my best today, even though my best wasn't what I wanted it to be. And I'm going to repeat the process again tomorrow and see if I can improve on that. And I did. In my particular situation, I love learning, but I had reached the point where my focus was so fractured that I couldn't read more than 2 pages of a book because my attention span was so shattered. I was struggling with memory. I had brain fog. I couldn't retain anything that I was learning. And so I had to really build that practice back up in order to be able to read a full book. And from that point now, I'm creating online courses. I'm writing my own book. Things have changed quite dramatically since my recovery, but that's how you repeat that process. Really small steps. Super, super tiny.
Yeah, I think it mirrors the 12-step process, doesn't it? It's being kind to yourself, it's being gracious with yourself, and then taking small steps and trying to do just a little bit better today than yesterday. Is that a fair statement?
That is a fair.
Yeah, I think that when I think about my bar students, oftentimes they will tell me that they have trouble holding their focus or they become overwhelmed and they can't take in more information. And our advice to them is take small increments, do little things, just build a step at a time as though you're taking a stair step in working all the way through it. But when I think about stair steps, I'm thinking about this linear progression. And so your idea of cadence, which implies motion and rhythm and timing and sort of movement, was fascinating to me because it seemed like while I was thinking in a linear set, you were actually thinking more in a 360. Is that an accurate way to think about it?
Correct. And I think that's where this sense of movement and motion, it's really important because we do move and our movement supports our memory and our attention and the way that our brain works. And so one example of that, for example, you're saying that your students are struggling with retaining the information. There's a lot of studies and research that has been done around the benefits of walking, for example. So if you have a stint of studying and then you step outside and you go for a walk, that is a really good way to help your brain synthesize what you have just tried to ingest, because you're moving. And what happens is that your brain synchronizes with the cadence and the pace of your footfall, and that frees up your brain to start percolating on those ideas and solving problems and basically creating connections between what it is that you've learned. And you won't be able to achieve that sitting at your desk. So that's where the idea of motion is really important as well. And how I tied the concept of cadence into my thinking as well is that I'm a keen cyclist. And so I use this analogy of the bicycle wheel. And so when our wheel is running true and none of our spokes are broken and the tires aren't buckled, you have a smooth ride through your journey. But when any of those things have gone wrong, it's a bumpy ride, which means that you could go off course or you're going to experience a lot more friction in whatever it is you're attempting to do. So cadence is about motion, but it's also about streamlining things and creating smooth momentum.
It's such a wonderful word picture for me. I was thinking about some work that I had read by John Rady, a Harvard professor. He wrote a book called Spark that talked about this benefit of movement and study. And so we teach our students to get up and actually have some time of movement before they study, because we can tell that it improves their attention span and their ability to hold on to that material. There is some kinesthetic connection between the way we learn and the way we move, isn't there?
Absolutely. Yeah. So moving before you learn is really beneficial, and then moving again afterwards. But when I say moving, it isn't necessarily going out and doing a hectic cardio gym session or running a marathon. It is more about walking is particularly really well connected with learning.
Yeah. And when you're my age, walking is exciting to me. You also talk about what you call flow and flourishing. And I was fascinated with this idea because, again, it suggests movement. All of your work suggests movement, which is just an incredible insight, I think, into the human brain and the way that we absorb material. But can you talk a little bit about what you mean by this idea of flow and flourishing?
Sure. I think that ties into this concept of intentional productivity that I also use in my work.
Yeah.
And Let me just distinguish what that is in relation to how we normally see productivity. So the traditional notion is basically based around a factory model. You're optimizing outputs based on inputs. So the aim is around getting more done. And then there's the author James Clear, who wrote Atomic Habits. He elaborated on that a little bit, and he said, for knowledge workers, it's actually not just about getting more done, it's actually about being able to do that consistently. And so where I'm coming at it from is a slightly more nuanced way of looking at things. It's about discernment and purpose. It's about bringing those elements into how we approach productivity and the way that we work and the way that we do things. And so it's about looking at well-being and meaning as well. And what I mean by that is looking at how can we get more done consistently in a way that supports our well-being and is meaningful to us. And very often we don't connect the meaning to what it is we're doing, or the meaning is based around the outcome and the performance rather than the experience and the journey.
I want you to say that again, because I think
Okay.
that's the essence of what we try to do. So can you say that one more time?
Sure. So I think very often we place meaning on the outcome or the performance. And what I'm trying to do in encouraging people to look at things from an intentionally productive way is to place meaning on the experience and the journey. And so it's about looking at doing things consistently, but also in a way that supports your well-being and is meaningful to you.
The reason that resonates so much with me is that when you're taking a high stakes exam, everything is built on the outcome. I pass or I fail. And yet, when I talk to people after the test is done, after they've finished and hopefully passed, it is not so much the passing of the exam that they remember. It's the moment of finding out that they had passed and sharing that with their family, or telling their children that they had overcome this hardship, or feeling this enormous sense of pride that they had done something that was so incredibly difficult. And that in that moment, the experience, that's what they were carrying with them. And if I talk to them 5 years or 10 years later, that's what they remember, not their score on the exam.
Absolutely. What I notice, and from what I've seen in terms of the way that you run your Celebration Bar Review training courses, is that although everything is focused around high stake testing, you are helping people to assimilate and understand the content that they need to know for those exams in a way that is focused on building mastery, and it's around project-based outlooks. So it's on the process, not on the outcome. And I think that this is how people need to think about it. Where are you placing meaning? Is it on the sole outcome of passing this test, or is it on developing and mastering the skills and knowledge you need, not just to pass the test, but to support you in your career going forward from that point? You're supporting your ability to learn, and that's an essential skill that you're going to need way beyond the test.
Thank you. That's very kind of you for saying. I want to shift our focus a little bit here, because one of the things that I wanted to make sure I got a chance to talk to you about is the idea of project-based learning and how to learn and put your information together. One of the ways that you came to my attention, in addition to your podcast, of course, is that you write a wonderful newsletter about Cadence, and you talk about these different approaches to putting together paper-based productivity methods. I think that's the way you describe it. Mind mapping was one of the things that we found a shared love of in how to learn. We teach mind mapping as a study tool, but I think it's also helpful for our audience to hear from someone outside the world of the bar exam what mind maps mean to you and why you think they're valuable and helpful.
I'm a really big fan of paper-based productivity. And as part of my recovery, when I was learning about different ways of working and living, I discovered that our brains actually work differently, or use a different part of our brain when we're writing things down compared to when we're typing things up. We synthesize and we make sense and meaning of the information in a totally different way. For me, as part of my recovery, I needed to spend less time online. So I ended up learning more skills like mind maps and the index card method, and also bullet journaling, which will help me to organize my thoughts and ideas and to manage my day-to-day tasks and planning. And so I'm a really big fan of anything that's also very visual. I'm quite a creative person, but you don't have to be working in a creative industry to use any of these skills. Most of us are creative thinkers in some way or another. And I would surmise that as a lawyer, you need to be incredibly strong creative thinker and critical thinker, because you need to be solving problems a lot of the time with the work that you do. So for me, with regards to things like mind maps and index cards and bullet journaling, what I like about the way they work is that they're visual, and that visual element really helps with memory storage and cementing the learning and with recall. What I also like about it is that it ties in with the way that our brains work. We think in a very radial way, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it's linear, but if you think about it, a spider web spiders design webs in lots of different ways. And the connection is that basically it's like a net. All the ideas and the thoughts and the themes and the concepts are connected in some way through different strands and threads. So even though when you're learning, for example, the law, you may be learning about double jeopardy, but maybe there is something in another element that is actually tied and connected. And when you can make that connection, that actually helps you cement the learning in two of those areas.
Yeah, it's remarkable. And I try to teach that the idea of visual learning means that your non-conscious brain is able to take that information and start to locate it and then connect it to other pieces of information. So the brain synapses are literally firing differently than when you're making a linear set of notes and it's just going in one side and coming out and you never look at it again. Mind maps to me are dynamic. When I start working on a mind map, I love the fact that I can then add pieces to it or add design or color or start moving things around. I'm a big proponent, and I did a lot of work with Howard Gardner at Harvard with Project Zero on multiple intelligences. And his view of intelligence, of course, is that we have many different intelligences, one of which is kinesthetic. And so what you're talking about with literally the paper-based productivity is that kinesthetic methodology. Now, to be fair, when you get old like me, my handwriting becomes basically indecipherable. So I have now learned to go onto a computer to do that. And it's a different experience, certainly, than working by hand. But the idea is still the same, isn't it? You want to get those ideas down and start manipulating and moving and working with them to see the relationships and to help your brain be able to connect them.
That's correct. And I think where the learning element comes in, it's not just that you are repeating rote what you are seeing and reading, just replicating it in the mind map. If you can change the wording, if you can customize it, if you can take the complex concept and simplify it, that is what's helping you to understand it and to learn it and to cement the knowledge connected with the concept. And so when you're working with the mind map, you're summarizing, and that's the same process.
Yeah, I love that. And we actually teach our students after they're creating their mind maps to read them to themselves, record that, and then play that at a very soft level on their phones at night under their pillow, just to continue to hear in their own voice, their own recollection and recreation of those words, to do exactly what you said. Here's the words, but now I'm talking about it. I'm not just reading the words, but I'm telling a story from my mind map. And I find that to be incredibly helpful to people to get this deeper understanding of material. So I love mind maps.
I think that's very powerful what you've just said about recording yourself, speaking the words and then reinforcing it. You are immersing yourself in the knowledge in lots of different ways, and that's what helps with cement the learning too.
You've mentioned a couple of other techniques that you use, and I wanted our audience to hear about these. One of them is index cards. And I wanted, when you and I were corresponding, I said, all right, I want to talk about index cards, but not flashcards. And so I'm going to give my definition, and then I'd like to hear yours. An index card is a way to organize information. A flashcard is a mini test that says I have to memorize a piece of information. That's my take. Now, let me turn it over to you. How do you define index cards and how do you use them?
So just like a mind map, they have a hierarchical structure, and they're a way of classifying and organizing and ordering information. And the way that I would use them in my situation is that if I'm, for example, researching a book like I am at the moment about the intentional productivity book I'm in the middle of writing, or I'm creating a new online course, then I will be learning and researching from various books because I need that to support the data and the information that I'm creating. So what I will do is I'll create index cards for what I'm learning from that book. It's structured based on the chapters. and I will summarize the key concepts from each of those chapters. But as I'm going along, I will discover, oh, in chapter 3, that actually links to something that was mentioned in chapter 1. So I will go back to chapter 1 and I will make a note about the fact that there is something connected between these two ideas. And I may write a separate index card for that particular idea because it becomes a theme or a core focus that I may want to develop as its own thing. And so that's what you keep doing. You cross-referencing. And as you do that, you're connecting the dots. And again, that helps with the synthesis of the information.
You put your index cards up on a wall.
I do when I'm working out the structure of my book and my chaptering, but I also use an electronic version of that through a software program called Scrivener.
Yes.
It works like a Trello board. It's really helpful.
If anybody is familiar with drafting screenplays or scripts, it's a great tool for that. I have great admiration for people that can do that and write those books and put that together. For our students, index cards might be one way that you take some of this information that you're learning, which is voluminous. You've got your mind maps, and I love the ability of a mind map to draw an arrow and say, this connects up to this idea. But oftentimes there are crossovers between subjects, and you might say, oh, I just learned something in constitutional law that applies to criminal law, and I want to have that connection. And so an index card system might be a way to keep that information.
That's correct. And it can be electronic. It doesn't necessarily have to be a paper-based system.
And then you mentioned a third form of paper-based productivity. You want to talk about that?
Yes. So I'm not sure if any of your listeners have heard of the bullet journal method. It became a craze a few years ago, and there's lots of celebrity YouTube artists showing these elaborately decorated journals that they've created. This is not that. This is the actual method behind all of that. And I find it an incredibly effective way to help track my tasks and to plan my days and my weeks in terms of what it is I'm going to do in my days and my weeks. You can also use the method as a learning format. So you could use your mind maps or your indexing within the bullet journal format.
Right. And if you could see my desk, I've got bullet journals all over the place here. I love this methodology. There's a lot that I'm trying to keep my hands on at any given time. So it's a terrific way to do it. But I go back to that Atomic Habits book that you mentioned. And sometimes it's literally just, if I know the workout at the gym starts with putting on my shoes, right, and tying up my shoelaces, it's getting that first step and taking that first step and making sure that I'm being intentional about that first step and then letting everything else roll down from there. So the bullet journal actually helps me do that. Do you find that to be true for your work?
Yes, I do. I actually have a little tracker within my bullet journal that helps me stay on track with things like fitness and meditation and reading and making sure I'm sleeping enough and so on. So I find that really helpful. Just talking about the habits element, another book that I can recommend is called Tiny Habits by B.J. Fogg, who's a Stanford professor.
These are all great resources. We're going to link up to your resources. You've got, as I say, a wonderful podcast. You have a newsletter that you put out, and you also are working on a book, and that's got to be exciting and just a great thing to come. This is quite a turnaround for your life, isn't it, from where you were a few years ago? When you look back, was there a turning point, a moment when you said, okay, that's it, I've got to change what I'm doing?
I think the burnout itself was the final big knock on the wall to tell me that I need to start paying attention, because what I realized at that moment was I didn't have the skills to help support me properly. And I knew that whatever it is I was going to do from that point onwards, and I didn't know what I was going to do for work, I just knew that it had to support my well-being better. And so that's where I'm at today. But if you'd asked me when I started my communications career 20 years ago, whether I would see myself doing what I'm doing today, not at all. I had no idea I'd be here. But I feel like what I'm doing is so much more aligned with who I am as a person and what's meaningful to me.
And I love that alignment. I think when you're in alignment with your values and your goals and your aspirations and what you want to bring to the world, it's so much easier to accomplish anything, whether it's passing a test or it's writing a book or it's starting a podcast or doing anything else. I am absolutely fascinated with your work. It is some of the most interesting work I've seen in the field. I'm a fan already, but I'm going to be watching to see what you do and where else you go. And I know my listeners are going to want to know more. Where can they find you and find out more about you?
First of all, thank you so much. Those are really kind words and very unexpected. I really appreciate it, Jackson. Thank you. They can find me at growthsessions.co. And the podcast is called Creating Cadence. It's available on all major podcast platforms. And the newsletter is called Creating Cadence as well. And you can sign up for that at growthsessions.co as well. And you can find me on social media at Mich Bondesi.
That's terrific. Mich, thank you so much for being with us. Thanks for sharing your time and your expertise. We'll check back in with you and see how the book is going. I would encourage all of our listeners to check out her work. It is truly wonderful, and I think just integrates so well with what we're trying to teach and what we want people to be doing. So thank you for taking time to be with us today and sharing your ideas. And we're just so delighted to have you with us. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Jackson.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Mich. I think that she has so much to offer. And for people who are taking high stakes exams like the bar exam, her work is really a lifesaver. So I encourage you to check that out. Again, we'll put all the links in the show notes. Want to remind you that we'll be back again shortly with Megan in June. We'll come back and talk about the exams from February 2022. We'll take a look ahead to July 2022 and where the bar exam is going. And in the meantime, we hope you have a great study period. If you're starting to study for your exams, it's the time to begin. And if you just finished your February exams, go enjoy yourself. Rest, relax, find some cadence and balance in your life, and we'll see you as the results come out. Take care, everybody, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for listening and watching the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers at celebrationbarreview.com.